On the last episode of the Keepsake box. For the most part, I slept all day. I spent the remaining time crying and looking through the contents of my Keepsake box. Each time, I dump everything out and reminisce over the details surrounding my acquisition of each item. It was a process that I completed in a similar manner each time. First, I started with the box itself. I thought of when I received it from Ken. We were out in the woods. Ken and I took pictures that day, and he gave me a promise ring. All of those items, along with the Whitney Houston cassette tape, were included inside of the box. All of the items were faded. That thought always took me back to the day that I planned to leave Ken. I skipped school to visit Grandma, only to discover that she had passed away months earlier. That was usually the point in time when I picked up Grandma's Bible. I'd open it and run my fingers across her handwritten name. I sobbed over her loss and my inability to be there for her. If I hadn't chosen my relationship with Ken, I would have been there. The Monica tape that was given to me by Tasha gave me a similar feeling. I was so angry over Tasha's decision to share my secret that I lost a person who genuinely cared about me. In short, I chose Ron's attention over our friendship. If I had allowed her to be a friend to me, maybe Ron would have gotten arrested for my molestation. Maybe that would have prevented him from raping Cassidy. I looked at pictures of Cassidy, and I always cried over my decision not to take her when Mom asked me to. I realized that my biggest reason for not taking Cassidy was my relationship with Antonio. I couldn't keep my place in the hierarchy if I had to care for her. And that thought always led to the next sets of items. All of the items were intertwined with each other. No matter what order I put them in, I was always led to the exact same place with the exact same regrets. The first item was the comb that Sharon gave me the first time she did my hair. I had so many fond memories of Sharon. We were inseparable at one point in time. And obviously, I can't think of my beginning with Sharon without thinking about our ending. The next items were both friendship bracelets that Peaches bought. One was for me and one was for her. Peaches was wearing her bracelet on the day that she was killed by Antonio's goons. I removed it from her body while she was in the bathtub. It may have seemed to be an unusual gesture, but I needed something that was more pleasant than the other item I kept, the note that I retrieved from her mirror. It was a verification that I had contributed to Peaches' death. A collection of random photos of me and Antonio were usually strewn about. There were so many good memories, but that good feeling was always overshadowed when I saw the ring. I was always saddened that Antonio hadn't gotten the chance to propose. The session always ended with me reading the letter from Antonio. I held that letter close to my heart as I cried myself to sleep. I did that every night for almost 2 months. I don't think I wanted to come out of that place. It was an awful place to be, but I was there. I couldn't leave. But of course, David came along and changed that. Chapter 3. This is Shelly. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Per the usual story of my life, David came along right when I needed him to. I didn't think he had a way of knowing, but I was incredibly vulnerable at that point in life, and David was there to fill the void. I remember the first time David called me. It was a Wednesday. A few things about our conversation stuck out, the first of which was his greeting. I answered the phone. Hello? His salutation was surprising to me. He said, Hi, it's David. He said it as if he were the only David that existed. Truthfully, I knew exactly who he was. I recognized his voice. It was much different than the voice of any other David that I knew. I attempted to mimic his cheerful tone. Hi, David. It's Shelonda. He laughed. I laughed as well. The second memorable part of the conversation was the fact that he acted as if he had encountered me on that very day, as if it hadn't been 3 weeks since our initial meeting at the coffee shop. David addressed me very warmly. I told you I'd call, didn't I? I searched for a response. I decided to go with, Indeed, you did. David and I had a brief, generic conversation before he got down to the intended purpose of the call. He said, A few of my buddies are meeting up at a bar on Friday. I was wondering if you'd like to join us. I paused momentarily, but answered quickly. Sure, I said. How does 7:30 sound? He asked. I told him that 7:30 sounded perfect. David gave me the pertinent details. I confirmed that I would be there, and we ended the call. I was intrigued. It was a Wednesday morning. I looked in the mirror and realized that I looked tired and worn. It was the first time since Antonio died that I'd had the desire to be productive. I looked at my hair. I had braids. It was far past the point where I would usually have taken them out. But after more than 2 months, I struggled to do so. They were the braids that I was wearing when Antonio died. They were long, nearly to my butt. I remember the night that Antonio died. I recalled him running his fingers through my braids as I straddled his body. I remember how passionately he kissed me, how he held me like he didn't want to let me go. My decision to let go of those braids was met with extreme apprehension. I felt that I was letting go of a part of Antonio, but it was time. It was past time. I spent most of that Wednesday removing my braids, unbraiding them one by one. I cut the end of one braid and placed it into my keepsake box. It would forever be a reminder of the last part of me that was touched by Antonio. I cried, so much so that I began to dry heave and lose my breath. I decided to take a nap and reconvene at a later time. I couldn't face being awake. After awaking, I finished removing my braids and washed my hair. It was long and thick. I was grateful to have had the ability to style my own hair, but of course completing that action made me think about Sharon. It was because of her that I had acquired that skill. The tears started pooling into my eyes. Unable to push them away, I took a moment to sob, but unlike the episode earlier that day, I was able to redirect. It had taken all day, but I finally removed all the braids. I washed my hair and wrapped it. I had to admit that I was proud of myself. It may sound crazy, but that was the first time that I had completed a task in its entirety since Antonio died. And that was Wednesday. Thursday, I awoke with a purpose. I needed to get my nails and toes done, both of which had also remained untouched since Antonio's death. I went to the nail salon and got a pedicure and a fresh set of acrylic nails. Although my mind told me to choose differently, my heart decided on a French manicure. Of course, it reminded me of Antonio, but that nail design was as much a part of me as it was a part of him. I decided to have the nail tech place a diamond and a solid gold line in the fingernail of my left ring finger. The diamond reminded me of the diamond that Cream had implanted into her canine tooth. The gold line reminded me of Peaches' bottom row of gold teeth. In a small way, it was very comforting and reminiscent of times past. A part of me was really tickled. Knowing the history that Peaches and Cream had with Antonio, it was hilarious that they were once again thrown together and forced to share a space on my fingernail. I giggled about that. After thinking about it, I paid the nail tech extra to redesign my nail art. I had her place a gold star on my ring fingernail, a diamond on my middle fingernail, and a solid gold line on my index fingernail. The French manicure would always remind me of Antonio. The nail art was symbolic of Star, Cream, and Peaches and our positions within the hierarchy. I wanted to climb out of the hole, but I didn't want to forget them. I needed to keep a small part of us with me. I decided that I would always have my nails designed that way. Antonio really disliked nail art, but I felt that he would approve of the symbolism. I smiled on the inside and went on to my next stop. I decided to shop while I was out. Nearly 2 months of binge eating and crying had left me with an extra 10 pounds in limited fashion options. I was quite slim, and an extra 10 pounds made quite a bit of difference. I could certainly see where the extra weight had settled. For some reason, I didn't consider losing the weight. Replacing my wardrobe seemed like an easier option, so I started the process. I went to the mall. I started out by purchasing some trendy jeans and a cute top. I liked the jeans so much that I bought 3 nearly identical pairs. Afterwards, I went from store to store, purchasing whatever my heart desired. It felt good. I began to realize the disservice that I was creating for myself by moping around in the house all day. It was time to get back to the real me, and shopping always made me feel better. I didn't even think of how Antonio used to accompany me from store to store, never complaining about my inability to decide. It was one of the few times that I had completed an activity without referencing an episode from the times of Shelonda and Antonio. For a moment, I felt normal. I felt free. I returned from my day of shopping, feeling accomplished. I threw on a pair of sweatpants, the same sweatpants that I was wearing when Antonio popped up at my house for the first time. The memories came flooding in. I remembered how confused I was about our interactions. I thought about how he brought Chinese food for me that day and ordered things exactly the way I liked them. General Tso chicken with extra sauce, lo mein with no onions, and extra broccoli. Of course, that led me to the realization that Antonio had ordered that exact same meal for me on the night that he was killed by Sharon. That was the last meal that I had eaten with him. A knot formed in my throat, and I felt the tears starting to form in my eyes. Incredibly, I choked them back. I no longer had the desire to be in that place. I needed a distraction, and the biggest one was staring right at me. While I was usually a meticulous cleaner, I had managed to leave my house in complete disarray over the course of those months. It took hours, but I cleaned my house top to bottom. It felt good. I felt accomplished. But shortly thereafter, the sadness started to creep right back in. I sat on my couch alone, wishing that I was anywhere but there. I pulled out my keepsake box and cried until I fell asleep. And just like that, I was right back in that place. Finally, it was Friday. It was the day of my date with David. I was nervous but excited. I awoke early and busied myself by preparing for the night. I was so excited that I arrived early, an unusual phenomenon under any circumstances. I parked my car and walked towards the bar. I stopped momentarily, feeling that I had made a mistake in accepting David's request for a date. Suddenly, it all seemed crazy. Why was I there? It worked against everything that I had ever been taught. Why was I so apprehensive? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One, I had gone on my first date with Antonio when I was 18, and I hadn't had many other examples of how it felt to date. I entertained Angel while Antonio was in prison, but he was very much like Antonio to some degree. We went on dates and did other things, but they were all very similar in nature. Angel was filthy rich, but we never did things that were extreme. He was still a homeboy of sorts, and he met me where I was in life. We went to restaurants, movies, etc. That was my comfort zone. But David was completely outside of my comfort zone for one big reason. The second part of my apprehension. 2, David was white. Growing up, white guys were the forbidden fruit. You could look, not too hard, but you were not allowed to touch. While not openly racist, Mom and Grandma were clearly not fans of interracial dating. I remember hearing them speak of black people who dated outside of their race. For some reason, Mom and Grandma deduced that those people wanted to be white or wanted to be better than everyone else. The ironic thing is the fact that our family was notorious for dating as light as possible. I guess there was a fine line between being very light and genetically white. For some reason, that made perfect sense to them. I stood for a moment and thought it all out. There were very few things that I agreed with Mom and Grandma on. There was really no point in basing my decision on their logic. Besides, maybe it was a good idea to try something different. After all, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten, right? But wait, there was a problem. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was doing the exact same thing that I had always done. The times, places, and people had changed, but I was still looking for someone to fill the void. I was still looking for someone who would validate me. And at that point in time, David was there for both. So, the decision was made. I collected my nerves and walked into the bar. While initially excited, I was immediately taken aback by the scene. Keep in mind that Antonio and I had frequented bars quite regularly. I had even owned a bar. I had expectations which were far overshadowed by what I encountered that night. Wearing jeans and a cute top, I felt severely underdressed. I had grown into a confident woman, but I suddenly felt insecure and out of place. I was immediately taken back to my first school dance in the 7th grade when I had arrived dressed like I was attending a church service. I felt like a rooster chia pet all over again, and I was equally uncomfortable. I hated the feeling of being out of place. I stopped at the door and started to turn around. Maybe I just called David and tell him that I wasn't feeling well. He was there with friends. I wouldn't have the guilt associated with him coming there just for me and realizing that I had failed to show up. It was settled. I was going home. But just as I was about to leave, I saw an arm waving in my peripheral. It was David. I felt as if I had been caught doing something wrong. I wondered if David knew that I was about to leave. I smiled and walked towards him, as if that had been my intent all along. He smiled as well. The bar was beautiful. It was very modern and different than anything that I had ever seen. The music was generic and nondescript, mostly music with no words. Nearly everyone was seated, with the exception of a few arrhythmic people who overconfidently swayed offbeat. The experience was certainly different from the times that I went to bars with Antonio. Everyone looked as if they had walked away from the office for a late lunch. David was wearing a crisp white t-shirt and black slacks. His tie was loosened but still around his neck. His jacket was draped across the back of his chair. David greeted me with a hug. He smiled and assessed my outfit. I wondered what he was thinking. David put my mind at ease. "Now that's how you do casual Friday," he said. I smiled. He made me feel comfortable in a situation when I would usually have felt anything but. And I liked that. David took his eyes off of me and directed his attention to the people at the table. He introduced them as Chad, Mandy, Sean, and Tina. It was very obvious that they were coupled off. David turned his attention back to me. His next statement should have created an awkward situation. It should have been bothersome and maybe even insulting. It should have been anything other than accepted. Yet, it was. David turned to me and said, "Hey guys, this is Shelly." Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shelly Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.